Thank you very much, Kay. What a delight to be here. It's really nice to meet you. At Imperial College, we're well known. We only give degrees in STEM subjects. But I'm pleased to say that we actually have a big center that delivers humanities and other types of teaching for all our students. So the Center for Languages, Culture and Communication delivers a program called Imperial Horizons, and every undergraduate student has a timetabled slot where they're able to come and study a course that complements their degree. And that's in everything from music technology to creative writing to philosophy to global challenges to professional skills. So I coordinate the suite of 30 or so humanities type courses on that program. But I just wanted to draw your attention to our identity here. Because our kind of strapline is STEMs need roots. And you can interpret roots in lots of different ways. Of course, they need roots to ground them, to add depth and breadth to their degrees. And they also need transport routes to better employability and just being more well-rounded individuals. So apart from coordinating Imperial Horizons, the Science, Culture and Society courses, I teach into the medical school, and I teach a course called Medical Humanities. I love teaching this course. It's an absolute delight. Whoops, something gone wrong here. Oh, there we go. And I've taught it for the last 15 years. I think you've got to be in range with this, have you? And it's kind of given me an opportunity to observe students over those 15 years and see the trends in their attitudes to medicine as a profession, but also to medical education. And it's been disappointing to see the disenchantment that students are increasingly feeling. And of course, the NHS is under incredible pressure. But students do feel disillusioned and worried, really, about whether they've made the right career choice. And often they feel a little bit demoralized about medical education. So I see it as my job with medical humanities to re-inspire students about the profession of medicine. At the moment, for the 15 years I've been teaching the course, it's been 3 months for self-selected students. And I should just say what medical humanities is, because it may be an unfamiliar term. But it really is the putting medicine into social and cultural context. In other words, how medicine interacts with life. And life in our context means going out there and having a look at how medicine inspires the arts, for example, and how the arts are in turn inspired by medicine. So we have lots of field trips, lots of creative sessions working with artists, and at the end of the course, students produce an artwork, which is not assessed, I'm pleased to say, but it is exhibited in our gallery. And they do produce an assessed piece of work, which is a project write-up that explains why they've chosen that issue and the kinds of artistic choices they've made. So the emphasis is very much on creativity. So from October, though, we're really excited. Our course is expanding into a whole BSc in medical sciences with humanities, philosophy, and law. And we've been really oversubscribed with that. So there's obviously a demand for it. So one thing I'm always reminding our students is that bodies are made up of molecules, but people are made up of stories. And we do need to ask ourselves, what kind of stories are we making available to our students? And what kind of stories are they telling about themselves? And are they able to tell about other people? Are they interesting stories? Are they inspiring stories? Do they generate curiosity? We do need to think about how we design curricula to encourage a growth mindset. And one of the stories that I've found helpful in thinking about this is the story of Heraclitus and Parmenides, two Greek philosophers that were engaged in an argument. So Parmenides said, the world is fixed. It's amenable to us. It's never changing. And Heraclitus said, no, the world is in constant flux. Things are always changing. And he famously said, no man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. But of course, if you argue that change, things are always changing, that's a constant, isn't it? So Parmenides actually won the argument because he said change is constant and therefore the world is constant. But manifestly, Heraclitus is right, isn't he? Things are always changing and in flux, both in education and in the real world. But in order to make things amenable for education, we have to behave, especially in STEM education, that as if things are unchanging. So we give students facts, we give them snapshots, and we do make things, especially in our educational language, we make things amenable to study by using words like focus, target, we want to nail this, we want to make things fixed, and of course, learning objectives. So it makes an object out of knowledge so that we can look at it and study it. But we do need to reconcile that with the fact that we know things are in flux, and I think it can be quite a problem for education if we deny that things, if we treat especially human bodies in medicine as if they are fixed. So we need to resist that a little. And one of the analogies I use is Exhibition Road. Hopefully you've all been down Exhibition Road. Imperial College is just behind the Science Museum. So you've got the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum and the V&A on that road. And it's bustling and busy. I used to work at the Science Museum before I started at Imperial College, so I've been going down Exhibition Road for 25 years. This is what it looked like probably about 10 years ago. If you've been more recently, you'll know that it now looks like this. What they've done is they've changed that road into a shared space. So there's no demarcation between the pavement and the vehicles. There's still parking spaces because apparently parking spaces are sacrosanct in Kensington. You can't get rid of them. So there are parking spaces down the middle of the road. There are coaches coming. There are bicycles. There are hundreds of pedestrians. It is chaos on Exhibition Road. Now, why would they do this? Why would they increase the chaos there? Surely that makes it more dangerous. But of course, this is based on a well-known experiment in Holland where they've got whole villages where they've removed all the street furniture, as it's called, all the signs telling you what to do. And because there's so much chaos, it makes the road safer. Because people have to slow down, you've got to make eye contact, you've got to communicate with pedestrians, and everything, the amount of ambiguity in the space makes things safer. And if we think particularly about the study of medicine, but I think this applies to quite a lot of STEM disciplines in which risk is involved, is that much of science is quite rightly focused at minimizing risk, about beating the uncertainty out of things. But that makes it very difficult when things don't behave in predictable ways. So if our students, as they increasingly are, I feel in medicine especially, learning things by mnemonics and learning protocols and procedures, and only learning that, then when unpredictable things happen, then they don't know how to handle that. So obviously, patient safety is paramount, and these procedures and ways of interacting with risk are really important to know about. But the main thing we need to do is to encourage our students to tolerate and manage ambiguity. And of course, I would argue that humanities is a great way to do that because famously there are no right answers. So students that study STEM disciplines that come and learn or read a bit of poetry and discuss it, there's no one right answer to what a poem means. But they're going through the process of listening to different interpretations and defending the interpretation that they think is most plausible. And this is really analogous to real life. Often decisions have to be made in climates of uncertainty where you don't have all the data, where there's no one right answer. And even a decision not to treat in medicine is still a decision. So we do need to work out how to encourage the tolerance and management of ambiguity in our curricula. Oops. So we're all very familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, and their creating sits at the top of the pyramid. And I've been encouraged to see that the last few days of the conference have really focused on this, and also emerging in Kay's lovely word cloud is creativity. But we do need to think about how we encourage students to be critically creative and creatively critical, not just in the methods that we use, but also embedding it in our curricula. And that is quite a challenge, and it does require some reconfiguration. So one of the ways I've found is, oops, sorry, I'm... Do you want me to just sit and click that? Click, yeah. One of the things is that things do absolutely have to change. Students are no longer willing to sit in a lecture theatre and be talked at. And especially with the increase in fees, that has changed students' expectations. So we really do need to think about how we add value to that face-to-face interaction with students. They need to feel that when they come to class, they're not just learning something that they could have looked up in a textbook or looked up online. We really do need to engage them in new ways. Okay, I am going to master the clicker. So playful learning is one of the ways in which I've found really helps to engage students. So I'm just going to give a few examples of how I've incorporated it in my teaching. Playful learning is an odd thing. It used to be my dirty little secret, and I was very quiet about it. But it has actually become a thing. I'm coming next week back to Manchester. There's a wonderful 3-day playful learning conference going on. It's really a community of very experimental, engaged, organized teachers that encourage using play in learning. And it just generates that spontaneity, creates a illusory attitude, by which I mean that students are willing to voluntarily accept obstacles and work out how to overcome them in a game. And it's social and collaborative. I think there's a lot of education these days is very competitive, so one has to be a bit careful with games that it doesn't exacerbate that. So I do like to focus on social and collaborative games. It stimulates creativity and empathy, and I speak for myself here because I find the times when I'm being most creative and empathetic is when I'm designing games for students and trying to project myself into their mindsets and think about how they might respond to different things. And it allows participants to enter a safe, imaginative space where failure is an option. We've been talking a lot about excellence recently, and the whole rhetoric of excellence can be actually quite constraining. Everything has to be excellent. There's no room really for risk-taking, and one has to meet these standards all the time. And actually it causes us to behave quite defensively, I think. We need spaces in which we can try things out, be experimental, and often when one declares something to be a game, there comes in that expectation that there's going to be an element of chance involved. And everybody just relaxes and goes with it, because it's no longer about individuals needing to perform excellently all of the time. This is a big problem at Imperial, that our students tend to be really incredibly focused, very focused on assessment especially. And sometimes I know some universities use games to get their students into the library. We need to get our students out of the library. And that's why we use games often. So one of my biggest, most successful games is actually Medical Monopoly. I feel a little bit embarrassed about having a wealth of riches in London, because I can choose from 20 different free venues. In fact, I could double this. I could do 40 that have some kind of medical connection, where we can declare a day where the students run around, get to as many of these as possible, and answer site-specific questions. So we divide them into teams. Every team has a Monopoly token as their team name. They get a board like this, and they get a little backpack with some craft materials in, and chance cards and community chess. And then there's a little question booklet. And what they do is they strategize about how many sites they can get to, and they accumulate money by answering the questions. So here is an example. So this is at Tate Britain. I might set a question like this, where this will be a page from the booklet where there's a little bit of context about Tate Britain, and then they need to diagnose some statues that they find there in Tate Britain. So I'm not claiming that they're going to learn a huge amount of medicine from this, but when our students come to create the artwork at the end of the course, they have been exposed to places that might have been on their doorstep, but they've never really gone to see. And just by being aware of places like the British Dental Museum, and of course we've got the Wellcome, which is absolutely magical, but the smaller venues, the Sayson Poetry Library, the Garden Museum, these are wonderful resources, and you can see them thinking about data in bigger ways. What kinds of resources are there and how they can use those in the project. So it's very gratifying to see them engage with that. But the funnest bit is really the chance cards and the community chest cards. So there'll be a little pack of these in their backpacks. The chance cards, they need to take a risk by even seeing what the challenge is. They link to certain locations. It costs £50 in virtual money to open the envelope to see what the challenge is, but they can make up to £150 if they execute the challenge satisfactorily. And we tie these to the things we've done on the course. For example, at the RCP, there was a lovely exhibition on Sir Thomas Browne, and we'd done a graphic novel workshop in the course. So we asked them to do a comic jam of the life of Sir Thomas Browne. The V&A, they've got this really weird sculpture there in the New European Galleries, absolutely amazing. This ox has got like a tumor, ossified tumor in his head, and they have to imagine what a death certificate might look like for that ox. Just example. Actually, the funnest one really is that every team gets a strawberry. And we team up with a course called Death, Autopsy and the Law for this, so that's why a few things are death-themed. But they have to photograph or film an inventive way for the strawberry to die. And of course we do get the strawberry being crushed in tube doors, but we also get incredibly imaginative scenarios there. My favorite is the team that gave the strawberry a Viking funeral on the fountains at Trafalgar Square. They built a boat, they put the strawberry in it, they set it alight. It was absolutely awesome. And the other one is the urine testing stick in the Thames. I always worry about this because I do worry that a student's going to fall in the Thames, so I'm always very careful to warn them against that, and then they tease me by tweeting that somebody's fallen in, but we haven't had any accidents yet. So these are just kind of fun challenges that they do, but it really gets their creativity going. And it's a good day. Something a little close, I should say that, yeah, Medical Monopoly, I can articulate loads of learning objectives for it if I have to. But the wonderful thing about games is not always predictable what students are going to get from it. So they all come back with different things, and it really is delightful to see them just playing and enjoying it and having fun. So I make no apology for my whole course really being fun. This is some teaching I do on science communication on the Imperial Horizons program, and it's a card exchange game. So I put statements from the course on these index cards. They'll just be ideas that we've covered. I tend to do this at the end of the course as a sort of revision session. And then we do this equivalent of speed dating. So students get some random cards and they arrange them in order of affirmation. So the statements that they like most at the front and the statements they like least at the back. And then they rush around and they read everybody else's cards and they try and swap out the cards that they don't like for ones they like more. And then we have a kind of pairing activity and they end up in a group of like-minded people with a set of cards they all agree on. And then they explain their choices to the class. And it's really useful because if students have gone a bit awry or strayed from kind of some of the central tenets of the course of what we teach, the rest of the class will put them right. I don't have to stand there and go, really? Really? Statistics are the best way to communicate science to the public? The rest of the class will do that for me. And it's just a good way of, it's easy. It's far better as a revision session than just putting a whole lot of concepts on a PowerPoint. I love teaching this session. This is something we do, and now you may be thinking, oh, it's all very well, small group teaching. But we do have to teach all the Year 5 students some dermatology. And this is a workshop that we do we do divide them into groups of 30, and we deliver the session 12 times a year. But what I like about it is different every time. At first my heart sank. 12 times a year, really? But this arts and dermatology workshop that we do, we work with an artist, she's very talented, called Sarah Christie, and she's made these wonderful objects that are very tactile. And so in this session, students will get one of these objects in a black bag, and they'll have to feel the object and describe it, and then they will draw it and they'll also model it. But what's great about it is that students have to question the assumptions they make about their ability for tactility. They all assume that they're quite good at that, but what the objects show, they're carefully designed so that students question some of their assumptions. So for example, some of the objects will have 2 holes in them. Students are very good at picking up the first hole, but they often don't pick up the second one, even if it's right next to it, the first one. And this happens in medicine all the time, apparently. You stop looking once you've found the first fracture, and yet there's a second fracture. Or there's a first tumor that you pick up, but you don't pick up the second tumor. And things like counting. It's actually very difficult to count things if you can't see them. So one bag is just full of little coloured pom-pom balls. And there'll be 11 in there, but students, we'll say how many are there, and they'll confidently say, oh, they're 9 or they're 15. It's very difficult to do. And you can stand in front of a class and tell students till the cows come home that it's very difficult to count things if you can't see them. But they will think, oh, I could do that. It's easy. But until they've actually demonstrated to themselves how difficult it is, it doesn't really get that point home. So in this session then, we also take them on a field trip over to the V&A, where we do a lovely tour of skin and sculpture. So I think it's always worth making use of the resources that you have. But interestingly, this session has not always been successful. Students have been really skeptical, arts, what's that got to do with skin? So we had, when we first started this, we had a high levels of absenteeism. Students just wouldn't think it was going to be worthwhile coming. So we made a few tweaks that have really made a difference, I think. First of all, we start by introducing an art object. So this painting, and we'll ask the students just to call out what they see in this painting. Does anybody recognize this Bruegel painting? Yes? Yeah, of course you would, Nick. Nick teaches art history. And so they call out and they say, oh, there's a farmer pushing a plow, and there's sheep, there's landscape, ship. And when we get quite far into this, actually somebody will notice, am I going to get the point right? Yeah, these legs flailing in the sea. And that just changes everything, doesn't it? Because far from being a wonderful pastoral scene here, it suddenly becomes a scene of disaster. And those are actually feathers flying around those legs. And we'll give students a little bit of extra information. The painting is called The Fall of Icarus. Ah, yes. People will remember the legend of Icarus, where his wings were made of wax and feathers, and he flew too close to the sun because he did not heed his father's advice, and he plummeted into the ocean. So this allows us to open up all sorts of conversations with students, to point out that you should never stop looking. Observation skills, absolutely essential. Communication, we get so much more from talking about the painting than just sitting looking at it privately or spending 10 seconds in front of it in a gallery. It also allows us to think about moral imagination. So I'm not one for advocating that the humanities teach empathy. I've got a real problem with that. But I think it does allow us to practice empathic listening and just to imagine what it might be like to be both the painter. We can't know the painter's intentions with the picture, but we can speculate, and also to think about what it might be like to be the characters, especially this fisherman over here, with Icarus falling into the ocean right in front of him, but he's not intervening. So thinking about imagination, we introduce the fact that they're going to be learning haptic skills in the ceramics workshop. and an awareness of competencies and learning styles. So all of that just sets the tone for the workshop, and students really are far more receptive to the idea that we're going to use the arts to look at dermatology. So while students at one end of the gallery are doing the haptic workshop, another section, the other half of the class, is actually looking at some rather gruesome images of skin lesions. So we have a consultant dermatologist leading that. And again, it's about describing skills. So we used to just get them sitting back to back, and one student would describe and the other one would draw. And then because it's meant to be sort of, this happens a lot, that you come across a rash that you don't recognize and you have to phone your consultant and ask for advice. And we realized, well, you know, students have all got their phones on them. We've got a big lab. Why don't we just send half of them to the end of the lab and they actually phone each other? And this has really made the session a whole lot more fun. Students love this. They immediately get into role. You know, what? You phoned me at 3 a.m. to ask me this? There's far less cheating, because if you're sitting back to back with somebody, you can't resist kind of just looking and seeing how they're getting on. So it's just changed things up. It doesn't take any more time. It's just a little playful tweak that really makes the session come alive. Oh, no, there we go. Right, one of the things I'm really looking forward to is that we're now starting to use escape rooms as ideas for teaching puzzle solving in education. So how many of you have been to an escape room? All right, a few, all concentrated down here. So escape rooms, there are actually quite a lot in Manchester. They are rolled out all over cities mainly, where you can voluntarily be locked in a room with a group of friends and you have to puzzle solve your way out. It's usually timed, it's usually an hour, and they've all got different themes and different narratives. But it's obvious that we could really apply these concepts to ideas that we teach in STEM education. Students love puzzle solving. So we're starting to look at this as an idea for perhaps we're going to involve students in designing them. So we're running a workshop in 2 weeks' time where students will come along for 2 days. We'll skill them up. We'll ask them to think about narrative and the types of puzzles that they might set based around curriculum concepts and transferable skills. And then we're going to fund the best proposals to actually develop an escape room. But of course, escape room is a big thing. You don't actually need to give people a room to break out of. The prototype that I made here was an escape room in a suitcase. So the suitcase had a lock on. You had to work out using the periodic table and a clue how to break into the first suitcase. And then there were a series of other challenges, including a roll-out keyboard, which had keys that you had to play in the right combination in order to open one of the locks. So there are lots of fun ways of thinking about this, and we're hoping that students will design lovely escape rooms that we can either use with first years to introduce them to some of the skills they're going to encounter on the course, or for outreach, or for prospective students. So we'll see how that goes. So tips for designing games if you're going to have a go, and I know there are actually quite a lot of people in the room that do use games in their teaching already. I've heard some fantastic ideas, including crystal maze themed activities, wonderful. But it is all about the audience, so you do have to think about everyone. For medical monopoly, if there's students with mobility issues, we need to consider that. So it's often a case of thinking about what people, because people don't like to feel uncomfortable. You have to design a game which perhaps challenges people but doesn't make them feel uneasy or unsafe, anything like that. So it really is about getting into the heads of your audience. It does need to be well designed and tested. There's nothing worse than a game going horribly wrong because you haven't thought out the mechanics of it properly. So it does take a lot of effort. And you do need to strike the right balance between playfulness and usefulness. We don't want to trivialize content. So you've actually got to motivate why you're using a game very clearly to students, and then they're totally on board. But if you're a bit wishy-washy about it, it doesn't really work. It can be playful, but it must be useful and have contingency plans. So things invariably go wrong. You organize an outdoor walk and talk type activity and it will rain. Medical monopoly, things happen. A few years ago, I set a lovely clue in the Hunterian Museum, which involved working out a mobile phone number to which you had to text your team name. Lots of opportunities for texting strangers at random if you haven't quite got it right. But that year that Hunterian was closed because a building nearby had been evacuated. So we have to have a dedicated Twitter feed to make sure that all the snags are reported. So you do need contingency plans and need to think about what happens when things go wrong, because invariably they do, because the world is always changing and things don't happen in predictable ways. Okay, so I'm about halfway through. The second part of my talk is going to be about my research into gratitude in healthcare and what lessons I've learned from, for education from that. But you will have been given a postcard. So everybody got one. So could we just take a few minutes now just to think about what tips you might have that you'd like to pass on in terms of creativity, from your learning and teaching journey. So personal, professional, it doesn't matter, but I did think I needed to point out at the start that this is going to be slightly gamified. Hopefully there are pairs of cards circulating in the room, so somebody else will have the same picture as you. And your mission for the day then, once you've written your tip, is to find the person that's got the same card and swap them. So do use this opportunity. You can be imaginative about it to find your partner. You can use social media if you like. But shall we just take, I think, 3 minutes to think about your tip. There we go. Hourglass. Write it down. Okay, right, so hopefully you've all got that and that you'll have fun interacting with people and finding the person with whom to swap your postcard. I'm really glad I decided to go old school with that one, because given my inability to use the clicker, I think I might have been in real problems if I had decided to use an app. Okay, so I feel really privileged and lucky in my job that I do get a lot of gratitude. I get a lot of gratitude from students and from colleagues. I feel really appreciated at my institution. And on my filing cabinet, I have a kind of little display of the thank you cards that students have given me. And when the going gets tough, I take real solace in this. I look at the cards and just remind myself that what we are doing is worthwhile. It's a sort of reservoir of resilience for me. But I have been deeply troubled by the problems in the NHS and generally the lack of morale. And it did make me think about gratitude and the way it drives morale and whether there are parallels in healthcare. And of course, if you go to any hospital on a ward, you might generally see a whole display of thank you cards as well. But it does worry me that there's a huge attention about complaints in the NHS. And of course, that's right, and as it should be, complaints need to be taken very seriously. But I feel that gratitude also needs to be taken seriously. It's often expressed informally, it's under the wire, it gets put on a board like this, but has the institution actually taken notice of what people are being grateful for? This is a wonderful data set we have here. And I feel that it's often institutionally invisible. I'm shocked to hear how little gratitude makes its way back to the people for whom it was intended. So I'm embarking on a study to look at gratitude in healthcare. My working hypothesis is that gratitude drives morale. One of the things I've been thinking about is the kind of similarities between higher education and the NHS in terms of a study like this. So one of the things, when I first wrote this a few years ago, it seemed a lot truer than it does today, because of course the fees have come in and the NHS privatisation agenda has gone up. But it remains true that the point of the benefit that students receive is separate from the point of payment, and that's true for patients as well. So, and in terms of doing an ethnographic study, most of the history of anthropology has been about economically isolated communities, and I feel that's partly applicable here, because students don't actually pay us as they come through the door, although sometimes one feels if they did know the cost of having a class delivered to them, they might appreciate what they're investing in more. So ethical issues can arise in the context of how gratitude is expressed. A colleague of mine was recently given a bottle of wine with a very pointed card pointing out that she would very much like to do well. And of course in the NHS there are huge ethical issues about giving gifts to doctors, and there are gift registers. Both institutions are increasingly reliant on gratitude in the form of patronage for funding. I'm sure your alumnus taps you often and asks you to be beneficent in giving funds. And that happens in the NHS as well. You walk into any hospital and there's big fundraising appeals going on. But I think it's important to remember that we are here to do a job, the duty of service provision. It's an obligation, and no student or patient is ever ethically obliged to express gratitude. So we can't expect it of them, but we can be open to it when it comes. So my research is going to focus on these areas. I would like to go in and do a gratitude audit in hospital. The site that I've chosen is the Royal Brompton Hospital, which is a famous hospital in London. I'm looking at the understanding of axiology, which is the philosophy of value. I'd like to do an ethnographic study. And I've got this wonderful archive of correspondence from the Royal Brompton. The Brompton used to have a sanatorium, a TB sanatorium in Frimley in Surrey. And it was open, I think, in 1905, and it carried on to the 1960s. And there was a lady almoner. So the lady almoner was a sort of prototype social worker. She was ostensibly in charge of feedback and follow-up, but she also determined which patients were well enough to actually go to benefit from sanatorium treatment. So she was quite a major figure in the whole flow of patients within the hospital and out of the sanatorium. But what she did was she would write to patients every year and ask them how they were doing. And as a result, there are these wonderful thousands of handwritten letters and the almoner's replies in the archive. And although it's about feedback, or follow-up, how are you doing, so the records were kept on how patients were treated and how they would do in the long term, what it really becomes is this wonderful circle of gratitude. So here's an example of a patient that was actually discharged from Frimley in 1906. Here he is, still corresponding in 1945, and sending a cheque for £25 to express his gratitude to the hospital for the treatment he received all those years ago. And the lovely reply from the almoner, "May I say how encouraging such an expression of gratitude from old patients can give to the hospital staff, as well as practical support." So, and this is just one example. I have hundreds. They're really lovely. But I think what this reminds us is that the almoner writing to the patients created an opportunity for them to express gratitude. And in our society today, we're really focused on ergonomically moving people through space rather than social discourse and making opportunities for those interactions. So the self-checkout at the library makes me very sad. Where do librarians get their job satisfaction from? Because you used to have a little conversation, didn't you, about the books you were taking out and returning them and getting recommendations. And that applies to a lot of places. London buses, you get in on one side and you get out on the other, and you kind of have to yell down the bus, "Thank you," to the driver. But you only pay once for one journey. Why can't we get on at the back and get off at the front? So there's just an opportunity to say thank you. This makes me very sad, the fact that the appointment check-ins. There is so much loneliness and isolation in our elderly communities. I think that the benefit of cash savings does not really merit having a machine-based check-in facility. So I'm not a clinician, even though I spend a lot of time teaching medical students. That means that I often get my inspiration and my data from TV. So there's fantastic documentaries. We all should be watching more TV. I just want to play you a little clip. This is from a series called Behind Closed Doors. It's on Channel 5. So let's see if I can get this. What happened to... Oh, here we are. Okay. Right, here we go.
So I think, Mr. Williams, it's really important that you attend all your appointments, because they're trying to find out why you're having blood when you wee.
Yes.
And there can be many reasons for that.
Yes.
But some of the reasons could be a bit concerning.
Yes.
You know, they're trying to check if you have cancer.
Okay.
So it's very important
Yes.
that you attend all your scans and all the investigations.
Yes.
So leave it with me.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'll give you a call next Wednesday to check how you got on with all this, okay?
Oh, yes, yes.
Can I
Thank
just...
you very much for your help.
I will give the department a call and let them know that you were here.
Oh, thank you.
Think we'll have to call you today?
Yes, I thank you.
All right.
Yes, thank you.
I will be in touch.
Yes.
Bye-bye
And I
then.
thank you.
There you are.
Thank you. Very much. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, so that patient said thank you 7 times. He kept repeating it until it was acknowledged by a nod. So that is really what he wanted to do. He wanted to say thank you. And grateful people want the opportunity to express gratitude. And I think often in education we perhaps don't give them that opportunity. Gratitude's almost always post hoc. It's part of closure. And we sometimes have courses where it kind of, your last class is a revision class and then it's into the exam, and you don't really have an opportunity to have that session with your students where you just acknowledge the journey you've all been on and how much you've learned from your students as well as they've learned from you. So I think we do really need to think about that. Since I've added a whole extra session with no actually structured content, but just a session to get together after students have handed in their projects at the end of the course has really helped to do that, I think. And even if you can't physically get your students together, just corresponding with them and acknowledging that you've come to the end of the course, I think does also generate that opportunity. And also we need to acknowledge it in ways that for the giver to feel it was worth expressing. So often on the TV documentaries, doctors that so often say, I'm just doing my job. That's not a helpful response, because you're not being thanked for just doing your job. You're being thanked for what extra you've brought to that job. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when people give thanks, it's not what they want to hear, oh, I'm just doing my job. Because it makes you sound as if you're just kind of routinely a patient, whereas everybody wants to feel special. And I think it's also important, lots of us have institutions where there are big anonymized surveys. They get collated by registry and then eventually filter back to you. The students don't know they often don't know that whole process occurs. They just think, oh, well, it's never got back to you with the feedback that they've been given. I find now that once I've received feedback from the class, positive or negative, just by sending an email to say, thank you for filling out, to those of you that filled out the survey, this was really helpful, this is what I'm going to be doing in response, but mainly just saying thank you for filling out the survey. It makes students realize that their feedback does count, and it really pushes up the rates of participation the next time one of those surveys goes round. So this is an article I came across in my research on gratitude. It's called Taking Care of the Hateful Patient. It was written in the 1960s, hugely politically incorrect, of course. But the kind of categories that Groves picks out, I think we would all acknowledge with a bit of a wry smile that sometimes we have students in our classes that do seem to fit this category, especially the entitled demanders. That students querying their grades, often quite aggressively, has is on the rise. And often it's quite difficult to deal with those students and their increasing expectations around, which are very much tied, I think, to the fees. But what's interesting about those students, and I'm sure if you also think back of students that have been a bit heart-sink in your class, is that sometimes those are the ones that are most memorable when they do express gratitude. So it's often memorable when it's ironic. Ask any doctors about patients that they remember the gratitude expressed, and it will invariably be the ones that were terrible at the time, that they had to section and the patient swore at them and threatened to report them to the GMC and so on. But then the card comes after an interval of a month saying, thank you so much, I'm sorry I was so awful to you, you saved my life, and so on. Those are the ones that doctors really do remember. And it is really the same with students. A couple of years ago, I had a student in my class. You know, the student, and generally my students are self-selected, so they all want to be there. But, you know, the student that doesn't make eye contact and sits with their hands folded in the back of the class and drains all your emotional energy. And the student came up to me after the first class and said, I'm here by mistake. I just want you to know. I ticked the box in a hurry. I wasn't paying attention, and then I didn't realize that the deadline for the appeals process had passed, and I'm stuck in your class now. I really want you to... And I didn't know what to do with this information. Was he expecting special treatment because he wasn't going to be as engaged or creative as the other students? I really didn't know what to make of it. It was really very awkward. But a few sessions in, we did a workshop on perceptions of pain with an artist, and he just had a light bulb moment. And he suddenly saw what he could do in terms of his project, and he did a fantastic photography thing. And that year, those students made me this lovely homemade card where they all wrote little notes on their people. But he is the one I remember because it's so ironic. Memory, assisted recall, irony-assisted recall is a thing. I want to play you this second clip because my final point is about narrative nuance. Because I'm interested in science communication, medical humanities, I'm really interested in the words that we use in settings, and we do, of course, a lot of work with students with clinical communication. I hope many of you are watching the wonderful BBC Two series called Hospital. It's set in Imperial Healthcare Trust, and I'm really, it's fascinating for me to see what goes on behind the doors of the hospitals where we often teach, but we don't often gain access to what goes on there. And also, I'm really proud to be training people that will hopefully be engaging and working in the trust. So here is this clip of a doctor speaking to a patient who's just undergone surgery.
So, she's here. All right. Good morning. Very nice to see you again. How are you feeling this morning? Yes, I'm not surprised you feel a little bit ropey.
Betty has spent the past 3 days recovering from her bowel cancer surgery on a high dependency ward.
It's very, very important to sit you out of bed and to get you out and get you moving and to get you breathing deeply, okay? We'll keep a very close eye on you. All right, bye-bye. She's obviously had her confidence hit a bit, which is perfectly natural, perfectly expected given the circumstances. So I'm trying to sort of build up that confidence and try and get into her head that she's going to be going home after the weekend. So I think that's probably roughly when she'll be fit.
We think it's going to be the middle of next week. It seemed pretty fast to us, but she's got a good support network, so someone will always be with her once she does come home.
Well, I have to think that at my age, maybe hanging off the bed space when perhaps 2 or 3 or even more people could have treated at the same time. I'm in a difficult position because I think perhaps I should be making ways for younger people who've got longer lives and more things to fulfill. It seems a bit greedy of me.
Okay, so lovely story there, and she obviously received good treatment, and the charming young consultant who was really communicating very nicely with her. But although there have been great strides in medicine to reduce the amount of paternalism that goes on, he used the word get consistently. We've got to get you to do this. I've got to get it into your head that you're going home. And this is not an isolated thing. I've watched hours of these documentaries, and there is a lot of statements like, "Can I get you to pop up on the bed for me?" So the language is still very paternalistic. And since I've got my ear into this, I've noticed that in education, we tend to do this a lot as well. We're forever talking about, can we get students to do this? Can we get teachers to do this? How can we get students to do this? Let's get students to do this. And now in my head, every time I hear the word get, a little bell goes off, and I think, oh, no, we need to be thinking about this differently and expressing it differently, because I think it creates this unconscious bias in our heads that it's a rhetoric of coercion rather than collaboration. So let's all be attuned to that. A lot of educational seminars, it's all about getting students to do. Words matter. And the rhetoric of compliance in the NHS and in higher education really needs to be more attuned to the dynamic relationships of dialogical moral relationships. So much fantastic emphasis goes on here about students as partners. But if we constantly talk about getting them to do things, we're not really treating them as partners. We're not acknowledging their voices as equal members in the relationship. So to sum up then, what have I learned in the last few years about introducing playful learning into the curriculum, and also my research into gratitude? Play is wonderful for unlocking creativity and learning in engaging ways. And that goes for you too. It's all too easy to become complacent about teaching, and it can get very stale and boring, often if you've got to deliver many things the same year on year or multiple times in a year. But just changing it up a little just makes it so much more fun. Gratitude is an important driver of morale. We do need to facilitate its flow. And we can enhance our narrative attentiveness by using language that is consistent with the spirit of collaboration rather than compliance. And I feel very strongly that establishing meaningful dialogical relationships requires imagination and generosity, and these are traits that we should be encouraging. So, my chance to express my gratitude to you and to Kay for inviting me to speak about something I'm absolutely passionate about. Thank you very much for your attention.